As we've seen throughout hominin evolution, throughout the emergence of bipedal creatures, there's always been quite a lot of variation, a lot of different species around. Some people say there were 20 or 30 bipedal species that emerged being bipedal in Africa at the time. When we come down to the time of Homo sapiens emerging in Africa at about 200,000 years ago and spreading into other parts of the world, they would have encountered some of these other bipedal Homo species that were already in these regions. And so there are other species that are in the genus Homo that would have been around from, well, I would say 200,000 years ago up till about 35, 40,000 years ago. They would have coexisted with them. Now, this section is called in the textbook the other humans and us, which I actually want to caution you about these thinkings. We have to be careful when we talk about our present that we are not simply projecting ourselves into the past and acting like we did something 30,000 years ago or 1,000,000 years ago. We didn't do that. Somebody else did it, but it wasn't really us. And at least from what I understand, and your textbook doesn't say this, but from what I understand of the genetic evidence and how these people would have behaved, the Homo sapiens that were emerging around 40,000 years ago and the Neanderthals at the time were closer to each other genetically than either one of them is to us. So it's not like you would go back in the past and be like, oh, I want to mate with that Homo sapien, but not that Neanderthal. You have been like, yuck, both of you. Doesn't work for me, right? And so behaviorally and genetically, they were probably closer to each other. If you brought them into the present, you wouldn't want to be sitting next to either of them, really. So we have to be careful when we use words like we did that. Like, no, there were Homo sapiens and they're their own thing at about 40, 50,000 years ago. And we have also been changing and evolving as well. Of course, the Homo sapiens are our ancestors. The Neanderthals are not. So the Neanderthals are not our ancestral to us, but we have to be careful with this idea that somehow the us extends way back into the past. We know the most about the Neanderthals. So the Neanderthals were actually named because the first Neanderthal skeletons were discovered in Neander Valley in Germany. And the German word for valley is Tal. So the Neander Valley people. And originally, when those skeletons were dug up, there's a lot of them, and people thought we have the ancestor to modern humans. We later discovered a wide range of Neanderthal skeletons, so stretching from Europe all the way over into Asia. We see them emerge at about 400,000 years ago and live up until about 35,000 years ago in some pretty cold climate environments. We have discovered that they are not ancestral to Homo sapiens. Now, in terms of their bodies and genetically, they're genetically pretty close to us. They're, like I said, they're within range. They are differently built. They're very stocky, large face and noses. So there you have more Neanderthal and more human than you ever wanted to see, but there you go. So usually more well-built, despite the common stereotype that Neanderthals are dumb. Their brains seem to have been larger than Homo sapiens, but that doesn't necessarily mean they were smarter. As your textbook says, that seems to be in a scaling effect. So in proportion to their body mass and the way their bodies were put together, they did have larger cranial size, but that doesn't necessarily mean better brains. Genetically and anatomically pretty close to us. They also have some some pretty cool stuff or things that they were able to do. They were controlling fire. So they used fire like humans did for warmth and cooking and all those things. They're pretty good at hunting. They had their own tool style, and you can tell, but it's called the Mousterian tool style. So they were in some ways better adapted to the cold climate of this region. Why did the Neanderthals not make it and the humans, the Homo sapiens, did? I've talked about extinction of the fittest before, but this may be a case in which they were very well adapted to the climate of the time, but as the climate started to shift, they were not as adaptable as they could be. Because what we don't see is there's not that evidence of fitted clothing that we saw with Homo sapiens. And they had a somewhat smaller population size, and so they didn't trade things and interact at long distances. Most of the stuff that Neanderthals used to make their tools and the objects that we find were within a few miles or 10 miles of where they lived. So they weren't trading things over long distances. There's some debate. Some people claim that Neanderthals were burying their dead, or that they were able to keep people who had, or their Neanderthals who had broken limbs, they were able to keep them alive. But I put question marks there because that's disputed or debated. They did use body decoration, so ochre for body decorating. They had made little bone necklaces and pendants and beads. So they did seem to be able to adorn themselves. They seem to have been pretty smart. And maybe it might not have sounded like our language, but they may have had language and a sense of self. So being able to adapt to their times. Now, we know the most about the Neanderthals. We have the most fossil evidence and perhaps the most genetic evidence on them. We've known for a long time that they were not ancestral to Homo sapiens, but their relationship has always been debated and what they were able to do. Textbook mentions another species, which is more recently discovered, and we don't have a lot of fossil evidence for them, genetic fishing. Yeah, which is a very sophisticated technique. And they only had a few little things in a cave in Denisova. That's where they get their name. Some bones and some stuff. But they revealed that there seemed to be this Denisovan species. They're like the cousins of Neanderthals. And they have a DNA structure that is distinct from modern humans as well. And so it seems like what happens is that as these Homo erectus populations expanded, that there was a common ancestor of Denisovans and Neanderthals around 400,000 years ago or so. And the Neanderthals mainly are over toward the western Eurasia, and the Denisovans mainly over to the eastern part. But there's a lot still to be found out. This is, again, a very sophisticated genetic analysis which produces this find, and we don't have a lot of archaeological or fossil evidence about this. The genetic evidence is really interesting here because when we think about what happened to the Neanderthals and the Denisovans, we have evidence now that Homo sapiens did interbreed with both Neanderthals and Denisovans, and as your textbook says, perhaps some other groups that we don't know about. So this coincides or corresponds to what we call the assimilation model, where we see Homo sapiens emerging in Africa, spreading out in different places, and interacting and at times interbreeding with some of the populations that were there. Now, these genes have actually been very difficult to find, and it was only about 10 years ago that people located some of these genes. It's not a ton, it's not a lot of influence, and most of these genes are outside what we call the coding regions, the things that are responsible for traits. And so they probably don't have much impact on thinking and language and those kinds of things. But there is a possibility that they could influence other traits. Now, ever since this evidence came out, people have been making all kinds of wild claims about Neanderthal DNA, like Neanderthal DNA gave me asthma, or Neanderthal DNA makes me more susceptible to COVID, or something like that. And we really don't know enough right now to say those things. We have to figure this out a little bit more now. But it seems like there are human populations. So we have populations across Europe and Asia, which all showed Neanderthal intermixture. We also have Denisovan intermixture, which is most apparent in populations in Oceania and in Southeast Asia. And as humans come together in other parts like the Americas, we probably have all that stuff going on. So when it comes to the other humans and us, I would say that in some ways they are actually a part of us. Or as our textbook talks about, we today still carry some of these hominin groups within us. Our genetic heritage is very complicated. And this occurs through a process of what they call introgression, which is not necessarily the same as interbreeding and creating new creatures, but it would be groups that encounter each other and have some periodic interbreeding, but their gene pools don't merge. And so we do know that there was some interbreeding between these groups, and it has left marks that we can see in our genetic heritage. And we are all part of this longer and older intermixture. But I want to go back to something that we talked about in chapter 4, where we began this unit, is that as of 35,000 years ago, we see only Homo sapiens around. These other species have gone and disappeared. And so when we think about our world today, the Homo sapiens of 100,000 years ago or 50,000 years ago actually would have encountered a much larger range of variation and saw that range of variation as potential mates, or actually mated with a larger range of variation than we see today. So some people get very excited about making laws about interracial marriage we've made, but this is a very small variation is what we have today. And as we discuss, the modern human phenotypes, the types of skin color, lactose tolerance, malaria resistance, body shape and size changes that we see in our world today, they're a product of recent evolutionary history. They come about in the last 30, 40,000 years. They are not deep in our lineage. They emerge as Homo sapiens go into these other areas. Now, I wanted to cover the Neanderthals and Denisovans because we know there's genetic intermixing there. There's a number of other hominins, though, they talk about here as well. These, we do not see evidence of genetic intermixing. They're just fun and cool finds that we probably didn't know about before. So we talked in the last, maybe 2 classes ago, about Homo naledi. Very exciting find of small-bodied and small-brained Homo species living in South Africa, probably around 300,000 years ago. Do not seem to be ancestral to human beings, there's no evidence that there's genetic intermixing there, but it gives us a sense of the range of variation that was going on at the time. And then, actually, very few of you picked this as your coolest species, Homo floresiensis, also known as the hobbit humans. What's cool about them? Very small. Yeah, so yeah, the textbook tells you that these are 1 meter tall. But then I thought, I don't know what a meter is. That's probably like 3 feet. So they're about 3 feet tall and pretty small brain size. They seem to be only located on this island of Flores here. And what seems to have happened is rising sea levels, they get cut off from the rest of the Homo erectus populations and probably get subject to what we call insular dwarfism, where if you're on an island and you're isolated, it might be better to be small than to be big. So I don't know, it's just a fun little species there. A lot of people got very excited about them. No evidence that there's any interbreeding or, in this case, probably interaction with Homo sapiens when they arrive at Flores Island. At the end of your book, they have this little section that's called From Our Past to Our Futures, which is basically to tell us, well, what is the evolutionary lesson from this? What should we learn about the past in order to think about the future? And they tell us that, hey, well, when we look back in the past, our environments are always changing. And as we know, they will be changing and in ways that we might not like so much. And what we can look back, at least according to our textbook, is say that, well, Homo sapiens have adapted. So, hey, we're cool. We've been able to be flexible and adapt, and we're going to have some obstacles in the future. But if we look at our evolutionary past, we've done all right. And I don't want to be pessimistic about this, but I just want to say that we can adapt if we learn the correct lessons from evolution. So when we learn about the evolutionary lessons, which of the creatures do survive and which don't? So again, we often hear about survival of the fittest, but as we see with these climates changing, the fittest often go extinct. They don't make it. So what kind of creatures, how did the Homo sapiens do it? How did we get there? I think that the Homo sapiens turned out to be more open to change and to being flexible, being able to try different things, try new things, keep being young longer. Diversity and variation is central to evolution. Being able to draw on different kinds of people, include them in your group. Being able to migrate to different places is a central evolutionary strategy of Homo sapiens, being able to move to different places. You cut people off from being able to move around and you cut them off and isolate them from being able to move around, we don't do very well. And throughout human history, we've been trading with each other and interconnecting with each other and talking to each other. We don't always like each other, but we've kept up these long distance trade networks over time. If we look out to today's landscape, if we look out at the Homo sapiens of today, if we look at ourselves, we're at a crossroads, evolutionarily speaking, I would say. And that there are some people who are open to being change and flexibility, and some people recognize the importance of migration and trade and interconnection and diversity and variation. And there are others who want to eliminate all of that, who want to change, want to keep people where they are, want to be interconnected with other people or talk to anybody that looks different from us. So I think that, yeah, sure, we can be good and flexible and survive, but it depends on the choices we make. It depends on the lessons we take from evolution. We want to believe that only the brute strength and the unchanging survive, then we're not going to make it very far.